Hi, everybody. Welcome to Brad World. I found something today that I just felt like I had to share. I found my first ever smartphone, if you can believe this. This thing I got back in 2004. This is the AudioVox XV6600, and this was for Verizon. This thing was the height of technology back then. I mean, this thing had 320 by 240 screen. Believe it or not, it still had infrared back then. It did have Bluetooth, and it had a camera. And actually, if you look on the back of this thing, it even had a selfie mirror. So selfies were going on back in 2004. I wanted to talk a little bit about this. Just reminded me of the history of my smartphone ownership. I've had a new smartphone pretty much every year since I got this one, and even before that, really, I had PDAs, the original Pocket PCs and Palm Pilots and things like that, going back further than that. So I've had a long history with technology to get where I am today, but I love these things. I still love this phone, even though it doesn't work anymore. The screen's all cracked and everything, but I've held on to it just for sentimental value. I mean, I've had this thing forever. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about my history with PDAs and smartphones. Now, the first PDA that I can remember owning was the Palm 5. I mean, I remember wanting the old Palm 3s if you remember those. But in 1999, I got my first PDA. I got the Palm 5, and of course it ran Palm OS. Now, but that thing was really sleek because it had the metal body, it had the leather flip cover, it had the stylus, and you could write and everything in there. And I remember syncing it with my computer, and I had my contacts in there and my calendar, which at the time contained very little information, but it was cool. It was neat to have. And at the time I worked at CompUSA. I basically traded my paycheck for goods rather than actual money. But it was something I wanted for a really long time, and I got it. I bought the Palm 5. So then the next year was kind of the real Pocket PCs came out, and I actually bought the HP Jornada, and I'll show a picture here of kind of what that looks like. But the HP Jornada, it was of course it was a color screen. It was a terrible looking screen. This is way before the days of capacitive touchscreens, but it was a color screen. It had this awesome clamshell flip open, and it had a stylus in there. It was really cool, and I had a belt holster that I carried it with me. And this was back before the days of smartphones. This was back really when cell phones were kind of in their infancy. But that's what I had back in 2000. And then eventually I upgraded to the compact iPack, if you can remember those. It had the big black sleeve that it slid into that held a compact flash card. And so I could take pictures with my very primitive digital camera and actually view them on my Pocket PC. And it was incredible. It was amazing technology back then. And then eventually I upgraded that the next year for the compact 3870 model, the iPack, which again I'm going to show here. And that thing, it was a little sleeker, a little bit slimmer. It had that nice metal finish, really looked nice. But I eventually got tired of these big devices, and I wanted something a little smaller. So in 2002, I upgraded to the iPack 1940, which you'll see here. It was real thin, and I used it primarily for ebook reading. I actually read ebooks way back when Microsoft, I think it was Microsoft Reader it was called. And I love these things for that. So in 2004, I got this bad boy. I worked at Verizon Wireless. This guy came out. I got my employee discount on this one, and I loved it. The keyboard on this, by the way, it has a sliding keyboard. The keyboard is terrible. These little bitty buttons with these little hard nubs on them, and it was a terrible keyboard to type on. But at the time, it was amazing. I mean, you could type out messages. You could send email from this thing. Now, this wasn't the first smartphone ever. You could probably consider the BlackBerry kind of the first smartphone. But this was one of the very first. And this had Windows, Pocket PC on it. The very next year, 2005, I upgraded to the AudioVox XV6700, which was kind of the step up from this one. And that one had a sideways screen. It slid up so you could type in landscape. And it had a little antenna nub on it where the stylus came out of. But that was my second smartphone, and I really liked that one. It had kind of the eraser nub, directional pointer, and it was also Pocket PC. It was a newer version, I believe. And I remember that one I had for a couple of years, actually, because I had one that worked well, and then it died. And at the time I had insurance, and I did an insurance claim and got another one. And I had that for a really long time. And there wasn't anything coming out at the time that I really liked very much. The Moto Q was out, and I didn't really care for the Motorola Q. I didn't like the keyboard on it, and things like that. But eventually, 2007. This is the only year where I really kind of had a similar phone for more than a year. In 2007, the Motorola QM or Q9M came out, and it was actually pretty slick. It was the next generation Motorola Q. It was black and red. It had a really neat interface and stuff. What I really liked about it was the keyboard. Actually, it had kind of a roughened keyboard, but it was really easy to type on. It was, of course, real thin. And what was interesting about this was my shift away from Pocket PC. This was when Windows Mobile Standard was kind of coming into play. The first generation in Moto Q wasn't really that great. That Q9M, that was actually one of my favorite smartphones that I've had, at least up until modern years. Eventually, it was time for me to move on from Verizon Wireless, and I bought the BlackBerry. I hated BlackBerry for the longest time. I didn't want a BlackBerry. I really didn't like them. But, where I was going to work, I needed a BlackBerry for work. I needed to be able to get my work email. And so I purchased the BlackBerry Curve 8830. So that was kind of my initiation into the BlackBerry world. And it didn't take long before I didn't like it. This was beyond the days where they had the slider on the scroll wheel on the side. This was the little trackball that they had. And I just never really cared for the BlackBerry. Of course, right around this time, 2007, 2008, is when the iPhone was introduced. And the iPhone, of course, was revolutionary at the time, but it was way overpriced. It was AT&T exclusive. But fortunately, in 2009, I went and stood in line and bought the iPhone 3GS. And that was my first ever iPhone. I loved the iPhone 3GS. It was a great phone. It had all the things that I had been looking for. But it didn't take long, before I was interested in Android. It was intriguing. There was a lot of new phones coming out. Windows Mobile was kind of being supplanted by Android. So what I ended up doing is I actually went and bought the HTC Evo. It was the first 4G phone out, and it was on Sprint. And this was in 2010. I actually went and bought that phone, and I took it, on a trip up to my parents' house in East Texas. And it was terrible. Battery life on it was horrible. Cellular reception was essentially non-existent up there. It really just wasn't that great a phone. So I ended up taking it back. And then again in 2010, just a little bit later, I ordered the Motorola Droid X. And that was from Verizon. And so the Droid X was kind of the first of this new generation of Android phones. The Droid X was an interesting phone because it had this huge screen. I think it was 4.3-inch screen at the time. It was very thin. It had all these neat capabilities, and I really, really fell in love with the Droid X, and I loved it. It was a great phone. But it wasn't very long before the iPhone 4 was announced, and I decided, hey, you know what? I want that Retina screen. I want the really sharp display. And I chose to go back to iPhone. This is where I kind of flip-flopped for a few times. So in 2011, I bought the iPhone 4. I jumped back on the iOS bandwagon, and I was happy for about a year. And then in 2012, it was time to switch again. So at this time, Android was really gaining in popularity. And so I bought the Galaxy Nexus, which I really liked. And then I got it home, and I had it for a couple weeks, and it was a little sluggish, and it wasn't the greatest phone. And so I ended up taking that back and switching to the Samsung Galaxy S3. That was my first Galaxy phone, the Galaxy S3. And to date, it's the only Galaxy that I've ever owned. And I liked the Galaxy S3. What I didn't care for were the capacitive buttons on it. I really didn't like those. I mean, I liked the physical home button, but it seems like every time I picked up the phone or tried to hand it to somebody to show them a picture or something, inevitably somebody would touch one of those capacitive buttons and it would back up or go away from that screen, and that was that. But I bought a modded back cover for it that worked with the Palm Pre wireless charging unit. So I was actually able to wirelessly charge my Galaxy S3. And it was great, and I loved it. And I wish that more phones had that capability back then. And then in 2013, of course, it was time to switch again. I bought the Moto X. And the Moto X, when it came out, the Motorola Moto X, was the iPhone of Androids. And that's actually a pretty apt description of it. It really was a great phone. I loved the Moto X. I loved the way it felt. I loved the way it worked. The battery life on it was good. The Moto X really was a great phone, and I really loved it. But then the 2013, as I was due for upgrade, HTC One M8 came out, and I really liked it. It had that gimmicky cover with the dots that you could see through, but it was a good phone. It was a fun phone. It felt really nice in the hand. It was a very premium made phone, but in the end, it just was just kind of boring, really. I was kind of ready to give the iPhone a chance again. In 2014, when the iPhone 6 came out, I actually pre-ordered it. I got the iPhone 6, and since then I've had pretty much every iteration of the iPhone. So I had the 6 in 2014, 2015 I got the 6S, 2015, 2016 I got the iPhone 7, and in 2017 this year Apple's going to announce their next iPhone. They're going to have a full screen bezel-less, mostly bezel-less phone with an OLED display and no home button. I'm really, really excited about the new iPhone coming up. I'm going to be up early in the morning to pre-order it, and I'm sure I'm going to stick with the iPhone for a while. I'm really into the Apple ecosystem. I try to stay as platform agnostic as I can because my history has been I flip-flop a lot. But like I said, I ran across this, and I had to share. It kind of threw me back down memory lane. I realized I hadn't really talked about all the different smartphones and PDAs that I've owned over the years, and I've had a lot of them, obviously. But so I'm really looking forward to the next iPhone. They've come a long way. I mean, look at how thick that thing is.